to you, although many of you already know him. Many of you are patients of his. And, I saw a few of you coming up and talking to him about your ailments that he's treated over the years. This is Dr. Scott Black. He is a homegrown product of the University of Kentucky. We're very fortunate he's still here because there have been a number of places that have wanted to recruit him away from us. From the flyer you were all sent, you know that he serves as a team physician both for the University of Kentucky as well as Eastern. What else can I tell you? He is an MD, but he also, when I first came here, I was very intimidated by the fact that my first graduate course I taught had an MD sitting in the front row. So he actually got his master's degree with us in exercise physiology. He is director of student health.
Employee health.
Thank you, employee health. So on and so forth. He's very actively, as well as his clinical responsibilities, actively involved in research. You see him at almost all of our seminars. You know, he goes out of his way to try to make these and contribute. And, you know, he's a man that always has questions. You know, can we look at this? Can we do this? Hey, I was thinking about this. Hey, I had an athlete or a patient with this kind of trouble. Can we take another or a different look at this and try to help people? Without further ado.
So more questions than answers. How many of you guys drink sports drinks? I'm looking around and I see Gatorade, I see a Powerade bottle, and I see just some generic glasses and bottles and cups of green tea and Diet Coke. So we all drink a lot, and that's not including recreational drinking. So drinking is an important part, you know, of our society. I think one of the things in sports and athletics is we kind of take the Gatorade question, and I'm not picking on Gatorade, but it's by far the largest sports drink out there, so I'll just use Gatorade generically as a sports drink. We all take the Gatorade question kind of for granted. It's good for us if we're exercising, and the commercials are really effective. So the question is, what's the evidence to support drinking at all when you're exercising? I thought that's what we would talk about today. This is a shortened version of a presentation I gave at SEHCSM this year, so many of you guys sat through that. You got to sit through it again. Here we go. First thing, let's do a little bit of review of body water. We're going to talk about hydration. We're going to talk about body water. And if we look at an average person, the literature says that about 60% of any average person is water. So in a 70-kilogram man, we're looking about carrying around 42 liters of water. And that's roughly broken down into about 60% of that water is contained intracellularly, so inside your cells, and about 40% is extracellular. If you look at these different compartments, the intracellular compartment versus the extracellular compartment, we have stuff in both compartments other than water, but there's a lot of extra stuff in the intracellular compartment. There's stored carbohydrates, there's lots of proteins, there's some cellular machinery that helps your cells do what they're supposed to do. So that sets up a baseline concentration gradient between the two compartments. There's more stuff in the intracellular compartment than there is in the extracellular compartment. And then if we look at things that are being actively transported between the spaces, we know that sodium is actively pumped from the intracellular space into the extracellular space. Potassium actively pumped the other way. And then water just naturally follows a concentration gradient. It easily can go through that semi-permeable membrane between the two compartments, and it just follows a concentration gradient. What's really important to understand from this is that the size of the extracellular space, the amount of fluid in that, is directly proportional to the amount of sodium that space contains. So the more sodium your body contains, generally the more fluid you're going to hold on to in your extracellular compartment. So people with things like congestive heart failure, we tell them not to take in a lot of salt. And one of the reasons we do that is we don't want them carrying around a lot of extra fluid. Well, if they eat a lot of salt, you may see swelling in their ankles, swelling in their lower extremities, and that's just because their body is retaining fluid, and that fluid is being retained in the extracellular space. Again, if we go back to the breakdown of all that and really just look at that extracellular space now, About 20% of that is plasma volume. The other 80% of that is interstitial fluid. So plasma volume is fluid actually inside your blood vessels, and the rest of that is outside the blood vessels, outside the cell. This is kind of the space between everything else. So the majority of the extracellular fluid is in the interstitial space. The majority of the total body water is actually in the intracellular space. It's important to try to keep all those in mind when we're talking about the At the capillary level, kind of where all the good stuff happens, we know that there's a pressure gradient between inside the capillaries and outside in that interstitial space, and there's an osmotic gradient also between those two things. So it turns out that at rest, the hydrostatic pressure from the capillary is a little greater than the osmotic gradient trying to bring fluid back into the capillaries, so that at rest, there's a little bit of a constant leak of fluid into the interstitial space. So if we're constantly losing a little bit of fluid into the interstitial space, why don't we swell? How come my ankles aren't swollen while I'm standing here? Anybody got an idea? There's another system that we don't talk about too much. Lymph, that's what the lymph system does. It helps bring that extra fluid that's out here, constantly being leaked in the interstitial space, back into the intravascular compartment. Then when we start exercising, something happens. Blood flow greatly increases to the muscles. And so when blood flow increases to the muscles, hydrostatic pressure, blood pressure increases, and we start pushing more and more and more fluid out into the interstitial space. So at the beginning of exercise and for the first 5 or 10 minutes of exercise, you'll see this net flow of fluid from the intravascular space out into this interstitial space. So we're actually losing fluid, losing volume from our intravascular space when we first start exercising. And in some of the studies that you'll read talking about fluid dehydration during exercise, they'll say, oh, this person was 15% intravascularly depleted because of the exercise. It's not always because of dehydration. Okay, some of that fluid loss is actually just this net flow of fluid out in the interstitial space. And if you look at that person again 30 minutes after exercise, you've had them lying down, and they're getting equilibrium established, that fluid will go back into the intravascular space. So you have to be careful how you interpret some of the results in the studies that you read about intravascular contraction during exercise or because of dehydration. Eventually what happens with exercise, if you keep losing fluid into the interstitial space, what happens to the concentration of things inside the capillaries? Goes up, okay? So when that goes up, osmotic gradient goes up, and those things eventually balance each other, and that fluid loss quits occurring. This is also probably related somewhat to the cardiovascular drift you see during exercise. There's a lot of things that contribute to that. It's not just dehydration. There's a whole lot of things that go into that. Talking more globally about circulation, we know that the heart and the cardiovascular system has a big job. It has to keep everything happy. It has to distribute blood to everything you're using at any one time. And there's really barely enough blood to go around. So your body has to do a pretty good job of picking and choosing where it's going to send the blood based on what you're doing at the time. It's always got to keep the brain happy, because if you don't have enough blood going to your brain, bad things happen. These other things, not so much. It can adjust, pick and choose where it's going to send things. When we start exercising, what needs more? What needs more blood? Muscles. Okay, so it starts demanding more blood. Your body has to choose. Okay, what am I going to take blood away from in order to send more to the muscles? Can't really take it away from the brain. Don't want to do that. I can take some away from the kidneys and gut. So we're going to slow down distribution of blood to the kidneys and the gut. We're going to increase the muscle. And as long as it's not really hot, I'm not exercising in the heat. The skin can get a little extra blood flow, but we're not trying to get rid of a lot of heat. So we're probably not going to send a lot of extra blood out to the skin. But now what happens when you add sun and heat to exercise? Muscle still needs the same amount of blood. Brain still wants the same amount of blood. Now skin, trying to cool us, demands a whole lot more blood. So now we have to take it away from someplace else, or we have to take more away from the kidneys and gut. So during intense exercise during hot weather, the kidneys and gut are not going to be very well perfused. Now I'm trying to put down a lot of fluids to keep myself hydrated during exercise. Gut's not happy about that, so it's kind of this tug of war between how much can I get down, what's going to be good for me, what's going to make me sick in the long run. And I think we probably all learned that at one time or another if we've been exercising the heat about how much we can take in, how much we can. Because you very well, you've seen YouTube videos of people finishing an Ironman or finishing a marathon at the end, just kind of coming out as they're coming across the finish line. That's because the gut's not doing a very good job. So let's go back to the basic question. Is hydration important? We all assume it is. If you look at the ACSM has a position stand, and a certain amount of hydration during exercise. Almost every sports medicine or exercise science organization has some kind of a position paper on hydration during exercise. So what's the proof of that? Is it really important? And if you look historically back to the first half of the 20th century or so, distance runners were uniformly told, don't drink when you're running. It's not good. If you're going to run a marathon, you don't want to drink, or you want to drink as little as possible during that marathon. If you're drinking, it's going to interfere with the movement of your diaphragm. You can't breathe as well. You may get cramps. So that's something new. Now we say drinking stops cramps. Back 100 years ago, drinking may cause cramps. You're robbing the body of energy. If you have to digest whatever you're taking in, your body's got to spend energy to work on that. And if you're trying to exercise at your limit at the same time, you don't have enough energy to go around. So those were common thoughts during that time. Again, in the early half of the 20th century, there were a lot of projects going on, municipal type projects for building dams out in deserts. The military was interested in how do people perform in a hot environment. They were starting to do studies with that. And this is one of the earlier observational studies. It's just what happens when people go live and work in a hot environment. It was in 1938, and this was out, I think, in the Nevada desert. And what these folks came from Boston, I believe, and went out and set up shop in the desert and just lived there for a couple of months. They would exercise on a daily basis. They each got to choose what kind of exercise they wanted to do that day, and they just kind of watched to see what would happen. And what they found out was that in the desert, in the hot, dry conditions, their intake of water was dramatically increased. The people would adjust their daily water intake according to previous water laws. But the water intake during exercise always lagged behind the evaporative loss that occurred during the exercise. And that's the theme that's carried forward to today. There's this term, and some people will say voluntary dehydration, some people will say involuntary dehydration, but it's pretty well established and accepted that if you're going to go out and do prolonged exercise, generally people will not drink enough during that to maintain normal hydration. There's a lot of reasons for that. Maybe the GI system just can't cope with demands, but people in general, on average, will not drink enough during exercise to maintain normal hydration. And that was shown, almost 100 years ago, and it's been shown over and over and over since then. But once exercise stops, the water deficit is made up pretty quickly, particularly when people are eating. The thirst mechanism drives you to drink after you've completed exercise. And then they also noted that they had a burro that they tested one day, and they noticed that animals do just the opposite. They drink quickly. They make a water deficit within a few minutes if they're given water. So if you're participating in one of the fastest growing sports in Colorado now, which is burro racing, your burro is probably going to stay more hydrated than you are during the course of that race. This is one of the earlier, and so that's 38. So jump forward 17 years, and now we're going to look at a study of how does drinking and salt intake affect work in a hot environment. And these researchers had subjects take in water plus salt, a 10% saline solution, which is really super salty water, or seawater, which is a 3.5% saline solution, or taking nothing while performing exercise tasks in the heat. So part of this was considering how people can perform work if they're dehydrated, if they're hydrated. Some of this was looking from a military standpoint at a survival. If you're in a lifeboat and all you got to drink is seawater, how long can you last doing that? So they were looking at a number of different things. But the bottom line was, if you looked at people that did nothing, took in no water, no salt, only 3 out of 12 were able to complete the exercise task. If they took in salt, no water, just salt, or is actually salt in the form of this 10% saline solution. So I don't have any sick at their stomach, but just salt. Only 2 out of 20 could perform the exercise task. But if you combine hydration and electrolytes, so water and salt, almost everybody can complete the required exercise task. So this was some of the earliest information that if you supplement somebody with water and electrolytes, or water by itself, there's a much greater chance that they'll complete an exercise task if they're required to do that in hot weather, in a hot environment. That was in the 50s. We've got 30s observational studies. You jump up into the 50s, people have shown that work in the heat is improved or enhanced if you stay hydrated. Still, the athletic world was not really buying into this. They were still, first half of the century, saying, don't drink during a marathon. You're going to cramp up. If you do that, your gut's going to explode. Don't do it. In 1969, these guys kind of changed things. They were looking at 2 distance runs in South Africa, and these runs were several weeks apart. They had a number of subjects that did both runs. The runs were around 60 degrees, so not really super hot weather. One was fairly humid, 90%, the other was more temperate. And what they did, measured the amount of fluid consumed, the weight loss during the race, and then rectal temperature before and after the race. Pretty simple. I think they literally had somebody accompany the people running the race and hand them water when they wanted it, and kept record of how much they were taking. And what they found was a significant correlation between weight loss, which they interpreted weight loss as dehydration, and rectal temperature. So the greater the weight loss, greater the rectal temperature. And they concluded that once your weight loss exceeded about 3% of your total body weight, your rectal temperature started really going up, and then that could affect performance and actually affect your health during the race. So this is the first time that I could find in the sports medicine type literature, there was a recommendation of this is how much weight loss you want to avoid during competition or during a workout. So 3%. And so they advise runners not to lose greater than 3%. This is their data. This is a graph of that. And there's a 3% line. So you can see that below 3%, not much significant change in rectal temperature, but above 3%, the temperature started going up. Now, the other thing I just wanted to point out on this is if you go out to football practice in the summer and if the football players would let you take rectal temperatures on them, you would find out that a whole bunch of them have a rectal temperature of 104, 104 and a half, maybe 105, and they're cruising along pretty good. So people have different tolerances for heat. The other thing is if you look at the end of races, go down to Peachtree 10,000, hot race, probably the Bluegrass 10,000 here, but hot race in Atlanta in July 4th or so. There's going to be a lot of people coming across the finish line that are probably a rectal temperature of 104, and they're still feeling pretty good. So there's a difference. People have different tolerances for temperature, but it's really when you start getting in that 104 neighborhood that people start having problems if they're going to. Generally below that, not a lot of problems. And so this range from kind of 3% weight loss up to about 4.5% weight loss. Maybe people can tolerate that with really not a whole lot of detriment in performance. And so remember that, and we'll come back to that in a few minutes. There's some other studies that may suggest the same thing.
I would say it's kind of interesting that in the late 60s, early 70s, salt tablets were very popular in the sports world. Okay, I mean, I was taking them as a high school athlete, so I was curious about that publication of '69 when they were saying salt and water intake. So it was already, even at the high school level, there was people taking salt. So I don't know where that came from at an earlier time period.
The salt came from some of those early observational studies and guys working in mines and on dams in the desert. And what they found with people total body cramps, and they felt like that was a salt deficit. If they supplemented those people with salt, they didn't cramp as much. Now, when they supplemented with salt, they also drank more. So, there's two sides of that story. But that's probably where some of that came from. So the question goes back to, is hydration important? And I think that if you look at the literature over the last 40 years plus, there have been many studies, and they've been fairly consistent that there is an adverse effect of being underhydrated during exercise. In a 2003 review article, these guys published in Current Sports Medicine Reports a summary of a number of those studies And they recommended that hypohydration by greater than 2% body weight impaired endurance performance, especially in the heat. Going back and reading their summary, I had a hard time finding out where they got that 2% number. I think that was sort of their best guess. Now, I'm putting words in their mouth. I'd like to ask them that question, how they came up with that 2% number. But I think it was their best guess at that time, their best estimate based on what they had read. That, you know, if you want to go for optimal performance, you probably don't want to let yourself get dehydrated by more than 2%, particularly if you're exercising in hot weather. So, okay, so we all accept that, and it sounds like the way to go. However, there's always another side. And several authors have challenged that emphasis on hydration. And what they have said is, and this, you go back and look at the studies, and during many of the studies, the subjects were dehydrated before exercise started. So the exercise itself is not what was dehydrated in person, but they came into the study either dehydrated by time spent in the sauna, by taking diuretics, by not drinking for 24 hours. Somehow they came in to start the study dehydrated, and then they measured exercise performance. In many exercise protocols, the protocol was actually a time to failure test rather than some kind of a fixed work rate like a time trial. So they would get these people dehydrated, they stick them on an exercise bike in a hot room and say go as long as you can. And as you know, there's a lot of other factors that influence that. There's a lot of motivational kind of factors. And people just, you know, this is BS. I'm not going to do this anymore. They just quit. So those may not be the best studies to evaluate that. If you look at in observational studies of endurance races, often the earliest finishers are the most dehydrated. So the folks that would say that hydration is not so important will frequently point that out and they'll say, if hydration is so important, why are the people that cross the finish line first often the most dehydrated? And then the other thing they'll frequently point out is we know that from a heat standpoint, people that have pushed hydration as important have frequently said that hydration can protect you from heat illness, or at least that's been a message that people have heard. And the truth is that maybe a little protection, but if you look at what really drives heat illness, it's the rate of exercise, the rate of work, how hard you're working in a hot environment. You can be super hydrated, you can be overhydrated, and if you're still putting out enough work, enough heat, and you're in a hot environment, your body can't dissipate that, you're going to overheat. So what's really important in heat injury is hydration plays a small role, but it's really the rate of work and the environment, that combination of things, and your ability to dissipate heat really drives your likelihood of developing a heat illness. And they'll also argue that thirst remains an adequate indication of how much water you should be taking in. So, Goulet looked at some of the alternative literature, some of the things that said maybe hydration is not so important. And he also looked at a number of the same studies that people had used to tout the importance of hydration over the years. And he did a meta-analysis in 2011, so relatively recent. And really true, when he did those, he whittled through those and was only looking for certain kinds of studies. The hypohydration, the dehydration had to be induced during exercise, not before. And then also only time trials, not time to exhaustion. He wanted a fixed amount of work you have to do to complete the test. And so he found, like I said, 5 studies that met those criteria. They were all cycling time trials. There was the temperature, the humidity. So, you know, and some are relatively moderate environments, some fairly hot environment. The intensity tested was, again, not super high intensity exercise. And the duration on average was about 86 minutes. So what's that? An hour and 26 minutes or so. So not real long on average. The maximum test was 128 minutes. So 2 hours and 8 minutes. So again, you're talking about a Boston Marathon winner almost, rather than most of the rest of us were in the middle of the field taking a lot longer to finish the race. His conclusions, though, and I'll let him speak for himself, this was a direct quote. Present results refute the idea that athletes' exercise performance will start declining from an exercise-induced dehydration associated body weight loss of greater than or equal to 2% under self-paced outdoor exercise conditions. So he didn't find any relationship between that 2% and whether somebody performed well or not. addition, he felt that people could tolerate dehydration if it's exercise induced up to 4%, and it does not alter exercise performance under real world exercise conditions. So again, if we start thinking back, okay, 4%, now let's go back to that study where the guys were exercising in South Africa and they started at 4% dehydration. Now people are starting to get up around that temperature of 104 when there's association there. So maybe there is something to that. And then this 2% to 4% range, that would be kind of in that range where differences in genetics, differences in training, and differences in acclimatization may make a difference in how well you respond. And he also concluded that drinking according to the dictate of thirst will maximize exercise performance. So again, we go back. Is hydration important? If so, how important is it? And if you look at Goulet's study, there were 5 studies, total of 32 men and 7 women represented, so we're making conclusions based on 39 people. They were all cycling, none of these were running, they were any other kind of sports. The temperature range was fairly broad, and the duration ranged from 60 to 128 minutes. So number one, I think what that points out is probably if in Dr. Yates' exercise methods class, if you didn't learn anything, you might learn that it's important to look at methodology when you're looking at results. And you have to understand the way they did things before you can understand the conclusion of the test. So when you're trying to generalize results, really look at the way they did the test, the conditions it was performed under, and how it was cycling specific to the test. And then what's your definition of endurance? The longest was 2 hours and 8 minutes in any of these studies. You have people now doing 16-hour Ironman competitions. You got people doing 30-hour Western States 100, not the winners. The winners are much faster than that. But you got people that are out there for a long, long time, and it's completely different. I think a completely different animal than a 128-minute study. You have people doing ultra marathons through Death Valley, Badwater. Think about that. That's over 100 miles in Death Valley during the day. So it's people can do remarkably long events, and I don't know what conclusions from this you can generalize to events like that. So, beat the dead horse. Is hydration important? And I think from looking at all that, my conclusion is that yes, it is. But that an exercise-induced dehydration of somewhere between 2 and 4% is probably pretty well tolerated by people depending on environmental stress, genetics, training status, and the length of the effort of the event. So if we accept that hydration is important now, water or sports drink? Which one? Which one do we need? Water's water. What is a sports drink? The problem with what a sports drink is it can be a whole lot of different things. And for our purposes today, we're going to talk about Gatorade, Powerade, the typical sports drinks, which are generally water, carbohydrates, usually a 4 to 8% solution, contains some of these carbohydrates, and some electrolytes. They'll have some sodium and potassium. Some will add calcium, magnesium, some other things to it. Some people will throw protein, amino acids, vitamins, caffeine, but we're really just going to talk about carbohydrate electrolyte drinks. We'll go back early studies again, and this is some of the information on carbohydrate support. This is an observational study of the Boston Marathon. I think at this time, in 1924, it wasn't a true marathon. It was 20-some miles long. It wasn't the official 26.2-mile distance at that time. But what I want you to see in this is the researchers measured sugar before and after the race, and they measured, or they just evaluated, and how's this person look when they finish the race? Good, they're bad, they're terrible, how do they feel? So this first fella, before the race, sugar was 81. After the race, his sugar was 63. He looked fair. Next guy was 87. After the race, his sugar was 49. He looked bad. Very poor, pale, cold, irritable. And they just kept doing that over. Here's people, very poor, shocked, stuporous. Sugar was 45. Very poor, pale, 47. So their conclusion was, if your sugar was pretty good after the race, you didn't look too bad. Here's a guy with 89, looked good. If your sugar was low, very bad. But can we do anything about that? Very next year, they come back, same race, and they start giving people sweet tea to drink. That was their sports drink at that time, your sugar-filled tea. And they did kind of the same thing. They measured condition at the finish, or they evaluated condition at the finish, and they measured blood sugar before and after. And let's compare. So, this actually, I told you something a little bit wrong. This actually represents the previous year, and this is the year where they gave the sugar supplement. And in 1924, person looked fair at the end, his blood sugar was 65. In 1925, he looked very good at the end, his blood sugar was 106. 1924, this fellow was very poor, very good. In 1925, blood sugar 50 and 114. So on and on and on, they kept doing that. And you can see that people that were supplemented with carbohydrates, blood sugars were higher, generally did much better, or they appeared much better at the end of that. So some of the early evidence said, hey, if you take carbohydrate during a long race or during a long event, that maybe you'll look, feel, and do better.
That second guy, you will go to the left-hand column where it shows running time. The guy that was very poor finished the race in 2 hours and 43 minutes. The guy that was very good after he had the sugary tea, he finished it in 2 hours and 43 minutes. So that was also a study to show that carbohydrates.
So performance better. Yeah, if you feel good, you're going to perform better. So back in the 20s, now let's jump all the way up into the 1970s. And this is really where I think a lot of the interest started. And you know who that is? Anybody? Keith Jackson. Watch sports. Yeah, maybe too young to know Keith Jackson. They still, I guess, doing some stuff. You may not know who that is. Robert Cade, one of the founders of Gatorade. There are actually several guys that worked on this at the University of Florida. But he's the one that's got a lot of attention. There's some great YouTube videos of the commercials of some of this, and I encourage you to just do, if you just do Robert Cade Gatorade Man, there's some really great videos of that. Get you all pumped up and ready to go run something. But their initial study, they published it in 1972, was a test of running around a track. It was, I think, a 7-mile long total test. And then this was kind of the protocol. So they had people do for the first mile, and they would run that, run, walk, and then run. And then miles 2 through 7, they walk, and then run. And they did it in 3 conditions: nothing, water, or a very weak saline solution, or a carbohydrate electrolyte drink. And they did 2 experiments, 2 different weeks. The first week, relatively moderate environmental conditions. Next week, a little more humid, but quite a bit warmer. In the first study, they just wanted to see what was the performance, what was the 7-mile time for finishing, and specifically on the track, what was their last 880, how hard could they run that? And then when they did the second one, it's just, okay, we're going to run 7 miles. Let's see in the hotter weather how many people you can actually finish that or not. And this is what they found. In experiment 1, if they didn't take in anything, 7 miles in about 82 minutes, the final 880. So for you metric people before with the new tracks, that's track 400 meters, it used to be 440 yards. So that's 2 laps around the track. 4 minutes. With a carbohydrate electrolyte drink, significantly better performance, both of these. Water, not so different than NDO. If we get up into hotter conditions, just can you finish the 7 miles or not? Not taking anything, average distance completed under 5. Water, a little bit over 5. With the carbohydrate and electrolyte drink, they all finished the performance. So this gave some indication that maybe if you supplement people both with fluids and with carbohydrates, and asking them to do a pretty tough exercise bout in warm to hot conditions, that the people taking the carbohydrate electrolyte drink should do or may do better. Since then, there have been, again, you think there's a bunch of studies on hydration, there's a bunch of studies on carbohydrate and exercise, and they're pretty conclusive that carbohydrates are beneficial during exercise. A couple of recent meta-analyses performed, and without going through all the stuff in those, the conclusion of those would, you could see an effect around 2% to 6%, depending on how the study was performed. And this meta-analysis included over 800 subjects. However, 90% male, women underrepresented, 80% were cycling, runners underrepresented, and the longest duration was 3.3 hours. So ultra marathon distance kind of things, ultra endurance athletes underrepresented. Another meta-analysis with similar conclusions, and their recommendations or their findings from that was that carbohydrate intake was somewhere between 30 and 80 grams per hour in these studies. In endurance exercise was characterized as anything over than an hour, and that they showed an improvement in performance. And if you go across here and look for time trial, about a 2% improvement. If you did a submax exercise task first, so I said you have to cycle for an hour at 55% of your VO2 max, and then we're going to do a time trial. Or if you look at a time to exhaustion study, or then a submax plus a time to exhaustion, you see that the time trial studies show relatively moderate improvement, and then these time to exhaustion studies are much different. And I would probably discount these. That seems to be a awfully significant improvement. That's a little bit harder to believe, but these, that seems fairly valid. Now, recently, there's been another study that looked at, is there an optimal dose of carbohydrate? We think that carbohydrate is beneficial in endurance exercise. Is there an optimal dose? And basically what this study showed was that this was carbohydrate intake across the x-axis and relative performance on the y-axis. And if you look at peak performance, it seemed to be somewhere between 60 and 80 grams of carbohydrate per hour. And they came out with an amount of around 78 grams per hour. So this was one of the other studies that shown that there's a ceiling effect, that there's only so much carbohydrate you can take in and do any good with that. If you take in more, your gut just simply can't get it into your bloodstream. But this was one of the first ones that showed that there's this curvilinear response to kind of at both ends of the spectrum. So I think the conclusion of that is carbohydrate beneficial, and I think the answer is yes. Probably that benefit increases as the length of the event increases. So the longer you're going, the more benefit you're going to get out of supplemented carbohydrate. Any amount seems to be better than none, and there may be a ceiling effect at somewhere around 70 to 80 grams per hour. Again, there's going to be a lot of individual differences in that. But something I didn't talk about is combination of the carbohydrate might be better than using a single source carbohydrate. Your gut has to actively transport the carbohydrate out of your gut into your bloodstream. There are different transporters for different carbohydrates, so if you use more than one carbohydrate, you might be able to improve absorption into the gut, out of the gut into the bloodstream. And a couple things we didn't talk about because we really don't have time, and it's really some interesting stuff though. There's some studies that just show putting a carbohydrate solution in your mouth, swishing it around and spitting it back out improves your performance. And how would that work? Okay? There's some neurologic pathways that may stimulate to decrease your sensation of fatigue. And you can again do a lip review for carbohydrate mouth rinse exercise, and you'll find some interesting stuff with that. And is there any benefit for events less than 1 hour? There's some literature on both sides of that. We'll cover that. So hydration seems to be important. Carbohydrate seems to have some benefit. Again, a lot of ifs. You do this, if this is the case. What about electrolytes? And the case to make for electrolytes is a lot harder to make than it is for carbohydrates and for hydration. I did a search for electrolyte solution and exercise performance, and this is one of the 4 references I got. And the other night, they were in obscure journals I couldn't even find. So this one I said, well, maybe I'll find something here that talks about electrolyte consumption and performance. And basically, what this study did was it looked at no fluid supplement versus water or a carbohydrate electrolyte drink during exercise, 50% VO2 max, 2 hours, 32 degrees, 65% humidity. And this is what they measured. They looked at differences in heart rate, rectal temperature, changes in plasma volume, and what they considered biochemical markers of stress, cortisol, different hormones, uric acid levels, and things like that that change when your body is stressed. And their conclusions were, well, number one, they did not measure performance. There's nothing on there that says if they exercise for 2 hours, this is the amount of distance they covered. Or they did a time trial, and this is how fast they completed that. So it really was not a performance study. But what they found was that in the basically NPO, not taking in anything, heart rate was significantly higher, rectal temperature was higher, plasma volume was lower, and markers of stress were greater. But if you compare water and electrolytes, there wasn't any significant difference between those 2 solutions. Again, did not measure performance. There have been a number of other studies looking at what do electrolytes do when you're consuming them versus not consuming electrolytes during prolonged exercise. And what's one of the things that people now worry about if we're going to go out and do a 14-hour event? And I drink nothing but water during the event. bad thing, hyponatremia, or my sodium is low and I seize, and 20 yards from the finish line, I have a seizure and I don't finish the race. So not a good thing. So there was some thought, well, maybe if we add electrolytes to the drink, people taking in sodium while they're exercising, they're not going to have as much risk of hyponatremia. And this is one of the studies that maybe suggested that. Basically what they do is have people do 3 hours of exercising in the heat, and they took in either water or Gatorade. And even though at the end of the study there was no difference, statistically significant difference in plasma sodium, and they are not statistically different. If you look at the rate of decline of plasma sodium for the Gatorade group and the rate of decline in the water group, the group drinking just water, the rate of decline of plasma sodium seems to be faster than the people taking in a carbohydrate electrolyte drink. So the conclusion of that was maybe you're putting yourself at increased risk by not taking in electrolytes. That was actually a repeat of a study, very similar study from almost 10 years earlier. And in this study, they really didn't find that, they didn't come to that same conclusion. So these two studies were performed very similarly, but had different conclusions. And why is that? We're running out of time, so I'll go through these and just show you. In the earlier study, the 1991 study, if we're looking at plasma volume and we're looking at saline solution, water solution, or no fluid, that first few minutes of exercise, you see that great drop in plasma volume when it's measured. Why did that happen? Is that dehydration? That's migration of water out of the blood vessels into the interstitial space. But then as exercise continues, in the NPO group, plasma volume continued to go down. That makes sense. Most people are getting dehydrated. But if you look at the water and the saline groups, really and truly, there's not any significant difference in that. There looked like maybe a little difference early on with the saline group protecting their plasma volume, but by the end of the exercise period, there was no statistically significant difference. So it didn't look like that the sodium had protected things too much there. Again, if you look at serum sodium versus exercise time, there was no difference between saline and water in that study. So why we have two studies that have done similar things and have shown somewhat different things. And I think that if you compare these side by side, you can see where some of this difference comes from. And you can see how remarkable your body is at adapting to fluid loss during exercise. If you look at the environment first, in the later study, it was warmer and more humid. The measured sweat rate, warmer, more humid. Exercise rate was about the same. So what would you expect with the sweat rate? Hotter conditions. Yeah. So greater sweat rate, almost half a liter more, I think more than half a liter more per hour. Rate of fluid intake was pretty well the same. So if I'm sweating more but not drinking anymore, how am I going to make up for that? Okay? Rate of urine production in this group was significantly lower than the rate of urine production in this group. So what that demonstrates is that actually your body is very good at adapting to fluid loss over the course of exercise, and very good at adapting to electrolyte loss up to a point over the course of exercise. So it does a pretty good job of taking care of you while you're exercising. We're remarkably well adapted to exercising in the heat. One of the things that you'll see over and over and over in a lot of these studies, though, is when you do add electrolytes to water, you tend to produce less urine. So you hold on to the water, or you hold on to the fluid that you should take in a little bit better. Even though this isn't probably statistically significant, if you look in the electrolyte group, they're actually producing less urine. Again, in this one, this is the electrolyte group, they're producing less urine per hour than just the water group. So you may protect your extracellular fluid, your plasma volume, by taking in some sodium. One of the ways you'll do that is you'll decrease your urine output. This is, again, these are those studies side by side, and I want to leave time for questions, so I'm just going to really go through these. But what I'm showing here is, if you plot them side by side, there's really very little, if any, difference between any of the measurements they made in the studies. The sodiums were very, very similar, and so their conclusions were very similar. So my conclusion from that is that it's much more difficult to make a case for the benefits of electrolytes during exercise. Pretty easy to make a case for hydration. Pretty easy to make a case for carbohydrates. A little more difficult to make the case for benefits of electrolytes. They're probably not that protective against hyponatremia, at least in your typical endurance event. And when you get out into an ultra event, if somebody is sweating for 12 hours and their sweat contains how much sodium? 780. Yeah, on average 780 milligrams or so per liter. You can imagine times 12 hours, that's a lot of sodium you're going to be losing. So maybe it becomes important there. Sufficient amounts of sodium may protect the extracellular fluid volume, and I had some stuff in here to demonstrate that. We don't have time to talk about that. So the extracellular fluid volume, maybe your intravascular volume, is protected somewhat. See, maybe, I don't have any proof of that. There's some indication that if you hyperhydrate somebody before exercise, they perform better. So maybe plasma volume has some influence on how well you exercise, and if sodium can help protect that, then maybe you can make a case for sodium as something that would help you perform. And that still needs to be proven. And there might be more benefit during ultra-endurance events, again, longer events, because it's very common that if you look at gate stations, Western States 100 or something like that, they have pretzels, they have raw potatoes that are peeled and sitting in water, and there's a big plate of salt next to those, and one of the best tasting things you'll have at the end of one of those races is get the potato out of the water, dip it in salt, and eat it. Sounds horrible, but it tastes really good when you're about 12 hours into a race. But that's all anecdotal evidence, and that's some work that if any of you guys are interested in something, that is some place that you really could do some work trying to evaluate that. So what is my big finish with this? I believe that man is well adapted to exercise in the heat and can tolerate a certain amount of dehydration with minimal performance deficit. Hydration has been shown to improve performance with more benefit in longer races and in greater heat stress. And water appears to provide hydration as well as carbohydrate electrolyte drinks in most circumstances. However, if you also are going to take in carbohydrates, if you think you need electrolytes during the event, then the drink does provide a real convenient package for all of that, rather than having to carry a goo. So you can do a goo, a salt tablet, and water, and you're doing just the same thing. Or if you want to do that all mixed into one thing, then you have your drink that can do the same thing. So what you have to do is decide what works best for you. If we look at the ends of the spectrum, Usain Bolt on one end of it, and this is Tim Olson. He was last year's winner of the Western States 100. How many times do you think Usain Bolt needs to stop in 100 meters to get a drink of water? 0. Okay? We all accept that. There's no controversy, no argument. How many people think that Tim Olson can run the Western States in a little over 15 hours, 100 miles, and not stop to eat and drink? Nobody. We all accept that. So I think we can agree on the edges of this, and then where do we come up in the middle? And I think with water, probably if you're looking at events that last anywhere around 3 or 4 hours, well, definitely 3 hours or greater, the need for hydration is there. The warmer the environment, the less well acclimatized you are, the earlier and more water you need to be taking in. What about carbohydrates? There's pretty good evidence that events lasting about the same amount of time, there's some benefit to taking in carbohydrates. What about electrolytes? We could stretch that. Maybe events lasting somewhere between 5 or 10 hours, somewhere in there is when your need for electrolytes really start coming in. Again, it depends on a lot of things, and you have to self-determine that in training to see how well you respond. In heat stress, it probably pushes those things all to the left just a little bit. And things like climatization may push those things all to the right just a little bit, training status. So you have to take all those things into consideration when you're making recommendations for how much fluids you want you to take in, how much carbohydrates you should take in, and how much electrolytes they should take in the course of an event. Future directions, I think the evaluation of sodium replacement effect on plasma volume and performance would be really beneficial, would be very interesting, something would be published. And also, any relationship with exercise-associated muscle cramping, that's another area where there's a tremendous amount of controversy about do electrolytes make any difference or not. And I think that would be some very interesting conversation to look at. So with that, I apologize for rushing through the last part of that, but I want to leave time for questions and comments and discussion. I'll open the floor.
In any of the studies that you looked at, did any of them talk about if the athletes or the people that were in the studies were acclimatized before they were entered into the hot and or humid conditions?
It varied, but most were unacclimatized, I believe.
Because obviously there results in difference, I just know some of them that are, they looked at acclimatized versus acclimatized.
And so what happens when you acclimatize?
Like everything kind of shifts, I guess it'll shift this way, according to your little charts in the last couple slides, it'll shift more to the right. So they'll be
So-
able to go longer without,
One of the things is your plasma volume expands, and that's a hormonal thing your body does to work with that. Your sweat rate actually increases, so you're gonna generate more sweat when you
cool,
exercise.
cool more efficiently.
You're gonna cool more. And your sweat electrolytes may decrease, but I think a lot of the thought is that even though your sweat electrolytes decrease, your volume goes up and the amount you lose, it may be a push on that as far as the amount of electrolytes you lose. But maybe to answer your question, I don't think many of those people both were unacclimatized in those setups.
What is your latest thinking on muscle cramps and fluid and electrolyte? I mean, we see it most often in basketball season. It happens during that because you see guys having to come out of games. And people have been talking about electrolytes and fluid for 30 years about that. Yet, I haven't heard any good solutions and stuff yet. What are you thinking about?
I can give you anecdotal stuff. I can tell you that I think there are probably different kinds of cramps that people get. I've seen some people talk about exercising muscle cramping versus non-exercising muscle cramping. And so exercising muscle, maybe that's more fatigue, muscle fatigue specific. If you're having non-exercising muscle that's cramping, it's hard to wonder how fatigue is playing a big role in that. People on hemodialysis are not exercising and they frequently get muscle cramps. So there's something to do with fluid shifts that precipitates cramps. So there probably is something to do with fluid, but it's probably more of a modulator rather than the actual cause.
But if you have an athlete that's cramping, what do you do as a physician? What do you recommend?
Well, the first thing they do is they get stretched because that's been shown to relieve cramping. So you stretch the cramp muscle and it relaxes. And it's probably some kind of a neurologic feedback that causes it. If we can't stop that and we have to take them off the field, we usually give them an IV. Normal saving, give them a bunch of salt. But I can tell you, more times than not, before a third of the IV bag is in, the cramps have stopped. And why is that? So that, you haven't replaced enough fluid and you haven't replaced enough salt to make a huge amount of difference. That the person's lying down, so they get fluid shifts with that. There's a huge neurologic influence on susceptibility to cramping. And I think if you get people just to relax, if you look at the situation where people are cramping, they're usually all tense. Sometimes it's in a really intense moment in the game where they're really giving everything they have, they're really caught up in it, and they start cramping. If you can get them to relax, I think there's neurologic feedback that may help with that. So I think that the electrolyte and fluid environment modulates a neurologic process that causes cramps.
So if you have an athlete that has chronic cramping, do you push fluids on them before the event and that kind of thing?
If they have chronic cramping, number one, you look for an underlying disorder of some kind, and you don't find it. There are some muscle disorders that can lead to chronic cramping. You want to make sure it's really cramping and not muscle pain from sickle cell trait or something else. And then I have given them push fluids. Usually, a lot of times what you find is that they think they're drinking, but they're really not. And so you really, so you put them on a drinking rate and say, you have to drink this much before, during, and after the game. You have this much salt in it, you have to take this in. And if you do that, that helps a lot. And I've even given people medication. You hate to do that, but I've had a couple of players that we just couldn't stop cramping. And you give them different kinds of medication, and that continues to work. Maybe it just relaxes them. Again, there's a big neurologic component to that.
What's in the water bottles on the sidelines that you take basketball games? And what's, when they have a timeout in football, when they
I don't
come
work
out?
with UK basketball, so I would assume it's Gatorade because we're a Gatorade school. Aren't we? We are a Gatorade school. Okay, so I assume it's Gatorade. You may want to
Not
edit
what
that. Gatorade actually, if you look at Gatorade, it's the amount of sodium it has in it is about 400 milligrams or so per liter. And but they make a product called Gator Lights that you can add. This is just a powder that you can add to it. It's got a bunch of sodium, a bunch of potassium in it to increase the electrolyte content. So they recognize that maybe some people want more electrolytes than others. thank you all. I enjoyed this.